Alright, we are almost done. We are left with Fury, Feral, Frost and Enhancement for our mini DPS specs by Enjoyment and Fun rating. A little bit of a recap of how we got here. We can see the likely predictable survival being put in D. We have some of the slower specs like Assassination being in C, and specs without too much variance in the rotation like Arms being in C as well. We have the wait a little bit to burst out massive amount of DPS in big windows like Ret, Unholy and Outlaw being in B, mostly suffering from the fact that outside of their burst windows they are sort of a little bit more boring, so this is going to be enjoyable for people who like to ride the high of big cooldowns and are fine with waiting a little bit in between. We have Windwalker in the fantasy world where they will work in Shadowlands in A, because on top of having decent cooldowns and satisfying cooldowns to use, they are also much more enjoyable to use in their normal rotation compared to, say, an Outlaw Rogue. And then in S tier we put Subtlety and Havoc. Subtlety has a very fluid and very smooth burst window, which also compels you to line up multiple cooldowns, buffs and debuffs on the enemy, but on top of that, what edges them out over other burst classes like Rat or Unholy is the fact that they can use Shadow Dance more often, which means it can center the entire rotation, even the base rotation, around Shadow Dance. When you're playing Ret and you're off your cooldowns, you just have a solid 40 to 50 seconds where you're just waiting, whereas when you finish your cooldowns with Subtlety, 20-25 seconds you're ready to go again. You are starting to already set up your Slice and Dice refresh, your Raptor refresh, getting ready with your pooling of energy and combo points, so it becomes a much more tight window where you always have to be on a challenge to pull it off properly. And then we have Havoc, as I mentioned already, a very cinematic spec, a very feel awesome with very little effort, which is going to be very enjoyable to many people. But now we move on with the last four. Another little recap. The rating is being done basing the enjoyment on your gameplay loop and your compulsion loop. The gameplay loop is the difference and the enjoyment on your rotation, how many abilities, how often you have to use them, what's the complexity and the challenge of doing the rotation correctly. Is it extremely rigid and not very flexible, or do you have abilities that you can choose when to use and how to use them, or the right time to use them? And then you have the compulsion loop, which is how satisfying it is to pull off the rotation, to use the rotation, how satisfying it is to use an ability, to use a cooldown. How cool is Pyroblast compared to Aim Shot? How cool is Frostbolt compared to Lava Burst? All of this actually compounds on your enjoyment of the spec. You might not know it, but trust a psychologist and doctor like myself, it's true. So let's get going. Fury Warrior. Now, if you've looked the previous videos, you will know that there is a lot of emphasis to be put on a spec's cooldowns, how they top off your loop, how nice it feels to build something up only to use a spender, a finisher, to top off your rotation and start again. If you have also watched my Mythic Plus video, I mentioned that Arms Warrior and Fury Warrior have a weakness in the form of lacking consistent burst. Fury Warrior is going to place itself in B tier, despite a complete and total lack of burst abilities. So how do they still manage to be B tier in that state? Well, it all comes down to having a really strong gameplay loop, which, similar to Arms when it comes to execute, it's only going to become better the more gear they have and the more haste they have. Fury Warrior is already a rather fast build. Between the basic haste from Enrage, the haste you can gain from Frenzy, and the haste you can gain from one of the legendaries, you can already be at 30% haste at the start of the expansion, which is already very speedy. Unlike Arms, they have to work hard to build their Rage, with Bloodthirst, with Whirlwind, with Raging Blow, even with their Execute, and dump it all in Rampage. This is a very nice and flowy rotation, and the gameplay loop is going to tie well with your compulsion loop in your Rampage finisher and your constant search, your constant hunger for reaching Enrage. Enrage lasts 4 seconds. You are going to be in this race where you want to get to Enrage, and then you have 4 seconds to get the rage needed to use Rampage, because then Rampage is going to put you in Enrage. And then after you use Rampage, you get into Enrage, and you have 4 seconds to get into Enrage again. It's going to be this constant cycle of very fast button clicking to constantly keep up your Enrage and constantly keep pressing those abilities over and over and over. It's quick, it's fast, it's entertaining and enjoyable. It feels nice. Again, as I mentioned for Arms, they have a nice animation and hit effect for Whirlwind. Bloodthirst is always cool to use, not as cool as Mortal Strike, but still cool. Raging Blow as well, and then Rampage is your big finisher, then you can start again. I mentioned as well that Fury has gotten some better reworks in their talent trees to make it more enjoyable. From Floating Berserker to Fresh Meat, it allows you to more often keep going with your abilities and your spam of abilities very quick. However, for now they can't raise above B, because at the end of the day, when it comes to their compulsion loop, where it comes to their anticipation, action, reward, they are very strong as a base, but they lack something to top everything off. Dragon's Roar and Bladestorm talents are not that enticing for Fury. They don't really synergize with anything else, and Recklessness is a very poor cooldown. In terms of power, is alright, but it doesn't modify anything about your play. It doesn't give you anything new. It doesn't modify anything about your play. It's not Torment and Fire. It's not Ascendance. It's not Combustion. When it comes to good payoff and great positive feedback from their cooldown, it's very poor, so they are still stuck with just their basic rotation and barely anything from their big cooldowns. So without those, they are sitting at B tier, which is still remarkable considering the handicap they have. And now we have Feral Druid, because Survival was being very cold all the way alone down there in D tier. So Feral was a nice guy, he's coming in cut form to keep the Little Hunter warm down in D tier. The base gameplay loop of Feral is to put DOTs up on a target and then continue the single target damage with Ferocious Bite. The DOTs are Rake and Rip on single target, which can increase on multiple targets or cleave with Thrash, even with Moonfire if you talent it. However, a crutch of multiple specs by now, I'm sure you have noticed. They do lack a compulsion loop centered around cooldowns and centered around big finishers. It doesn't matter which type of finisher it is. It doesn't matter if it's shortish and constantly happening like Shadowlands, or if it's longer and requires multiple cooldowns like Avenging Wrath, or if it's just, you know, a single cooldown which is going to change the way the pace of your rotation like Combustion. Feral doesn't have anything. Berserk is a bad cooldown, it has been buffed, it's still bad. Tiger's Fury is a 30-second cooldown stronger than a 3-minute cooldown, but still, it's just an energy regen and some damage increase. It's not going to change much of anything in your build. At the end of the day, your single target finisher is still one, and it is Ferocious Bite, and that's it. When it comes to AoE, the problem remains the same as Mythic Plus. When it comes to the compulsion loop, you do have increased difficulty, which means increased challenge, increased engagement and focus that is put on you to play the spec well, which is good. It's something that is good when it happens on a spec on multiple targets. Imagine Outlaw Rogue, imagine Demon Hunter. Their spec and their rotation doesn't change much when they have to hit multiple targets. It's just about the same. Specs like Shadow Priest, specs like Affliction Warlock, and specs like Feral Druid, and even Assassination Rogue become increasingly more engaging, increasingly more complex, and therefore satisfying to pull off when the targets increase. When it comes to Feral, as I mentioned, their crutch in Mythic Plus is that stuff dies too fast, and their way to set up DOTs is not closed off in a compulsion loop with a big finisher. Affliction Warlocks have Malefic Rapture, Shadow Priests have Searing Nightmare, Unholy DKs have several cooldowns to use, and Epidemic. Feral Druids have nothing. So they have a big ramp up, a big anticipation, a big action, and they're gonna lack the payoff. And in single target, their spec is nothing to write home about, especially since it's been simplified. You can now avoid Savage Roar. At the end of the day, you just have 2 DOTs to keep up on target and then spamming Ferocious Bite. It's not as entertaining as before. The crucial lack of cooldown and lack of burst, which is going to give you either short but frequent or long but distant payoff windows, which Feral is lacking, means they stay in D tier. Frost DK is the exact opposite of Fury Warrior. Fury Warrior is in B tier, despite their lack of big finisher, despite the lack of big gratifications at the end of their rotation, because rather than having 5 out of 10 lows and 9 out of 10 highs, they have a very sustained and stable 6.5, 7 out of 10 rotation that is consistent and constant, whereas Frost DK is going to slot itself in A tier, despite only having 3 buttons to use. Because their core gameplay loop, their core rotation is going to be spending runes with Howling Blast and Obliterate, and then spending runic power with Frost Strike. That's all there is. There is no more complexity, there is no more finesse, nothing of the sort. They can instead spend runic power with Glacial Advance, or spend the runes with their Frostbite AoE, but it doesn't change. The buttons are still very few, and the rotation is extremely simple. But why do they make it to A tier without a basic rotation? What's their savior? Fury's savior to get to B without cooldowns was their amazing base rotation, and then Frost obviously has the opposite result. They have massive amount of cooldowns. That's why they are in A. Their rating is closer to A+ if they are in Mythic Plus or massive AoE situations or cleave situations, and more like B+ or A- if they are in single target due to their cooldowns being more suited for AoE. Frost DK is able to use Frostworm Fury, Empower Rune Weapon, their Covenant ability like Swarming Mist, Breath of Sindragosa, Pillar of Frost, and Remorseless Winter, as well as even Hypothermic Presence. This is 6, even 7 cooldowns they can choose to use. What's also good is that Empower Rune Weapon and Breath of Sindragosa pretty much are paired together every 2 minutes. Pillar of Frost and Remorseless Winter are paired together every 45 seconds, or a minute every other Breath of Sindragosa. It's very easy to pair them together, and they are up very often. Their base rotation essentially falls in the background in the face of so many cooldowns that are going to elevate your rotation despite a very bad basic rotation. And this is not just about pressing a cooldown. You couldn't justify a rotation being engaging just because you have a cooldown if the cooldown just, you click it, it does some damage. If you do it once every 2 minutes and you have 3 buttons to press in the meanwhile, it's still gonna be very boring. The payoff when it comes to Frost DK is they have abilities and talents like Gathering Storm, which can increase the duration of your Remorseless Winter whenever you spend runes, as well as Breath of Sindragosa, which can increase the duration, which is what is going to give you a very good compulsion loop. You essentially create minigames within your own rotation. You want to try to pool your runes and spend as many as you can, maybe even use Empower Rune Weapon to get you more runes, maybe use Horn of Winter to get you even more runes, just so you can make a longer lasting Remorseless Winter, and then you can do the same thing for Runic Power when it comes to Breath of Sindragosa. You can pair it up with Hypothermic Presence for more Runic Power generation, Swarming Mist for more Runic Power generation, and then you can pool your Runic Power just to use Breath of Sindragosa. It's very fun, it's very engaging to essentially beat the AI, beat the talent system and the passive system you have in this minigame as a Frost DK, even though you only have 3 abilities. It feels very rewarding and it feels very satisfying. The aesthetic and the style and the flair of Frost DK is also pretty strong. Lots of their abilities are very cool to see, are very cool to use. Obliterate does feel like, you know, an Obliterate ability. It feels very chunky and very heavy to use. Howling Blast is pretty cool. Breath of Sindragosa is obviously amazing. They have Frostworm's Fury baseline, which is also great to look at. Remorseless Winter is obviously great. So you have all these cool looking things that also put a challenge on you, an extra challenge on you that you have to pull off properly to do increased damage and to make it work better. It is a very nice spec with several satisfying loops of enjoyment you can have within the rotation, which can make you overlook the fact that at the end of the day you're only pressing 3 abilities to do damage. It's a very unique way to make a spec work. So they deserve to sit in A tier. And last we have Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman has very varied and multiple options to choose from, chosen on purpose right after Frost DK. Enhancement Shaman doesn't even have a base default builder spender. They can build Maelstrom stacks and spend them in an instacast spell, but beyond that, it's just a various different system within a system within a system. They have to use Stormstrike on cooldown, Lava Lash on cooldown. They can use Flame Shock and use it on multiple targets for cleave, or they can keep using Frost Shock as a single target extra ability. They can use Crush Lightning on cooldown, on cleave on multi-target situations. They can use Sundering. They can spend their Maelstrom stacks with Lightning Bolt or with Chain Lightning. They are, by far, the melee spec with the most diverse and rewarding base rotation, base gameplay loop. This puts them in A tier. The reason why they don't go any higher than A tier when we look at the compulsion loop is because they lack some extra payoff. They have a very standard, very similar to Elemental Shaman, they have a very standard and continuous good payoff. The payoff of using Stormstrike and using, for example, your Legacy of the Frost Switch legendary and properly refreshing Stormstrike, having your Thundering, having your Hailstorm talent, and then using a very big Frost Shock, getting to your Maelstrom stacks to consume them and use on instacast Lightning Bolt. Several combos you can do with this. Get to 10 stacks of Maelstrom, use your Stormstrike, immediately consume 5 Maelstrom to reset the cooldown of Stormstrike, use Stormstrike again, immediately consume your other 5 stacks of Maelstrom to use your Stormstrike again. All of this is going to feel cool and it's going to feel nice. The problem is there is nothing extra. Right now, the only base cooldown you have is Feral Spirit. Feral Spirit has a 2-minute cooldown and it doesn't deserve to be a 2-minute cooldown because it's terrible right now. Blizzard has mentioned they're gonna be fixing it, they're gonna be do something about it. We don't know what and we don't know when, but for now it's underwhelming. It is a cooldown It is a cooldown on a similar level to something like Wings or to something like Shadowlands in duration and cooldown, and it just doesn't do enough. The payoff is not cool enough. Even the look, the model, the animation, the sound, it doesn't feel as cool as an Infernal or a Storm Elemental. They would have just needed something else to make it to S tier. Right now, they have a very solid base rotation. Their base compulsion loop of positive feedback and cool things happening in the rotation, making you excited and wanting to get to that part of the rotation again, are very nice, are very cool to play in. However, it stops there. There is no big finisher, there is no big finale. It just sort of quells down there. So it's an A tier for Enhancement Shaman. So we are done with the comparison on enjoyment and fun of melee DPS specs. We can see the little preview of what's gonna be coming in the future videos about both melee and range DPS, the comparison between their enjoyment and fun in their basic rotations and their general reward when using their abilities compared to their perceived strength in Mythic Plus. The videos are gonna have the comparison with this, but also some comments on some changes related to raids in terms of their power, because remember, when it comes to Mythic Plus rating, things like defensives, immunities, utility, stun, slows, battle rest, etc. come into play way more, and also get to affect the enjoyability. Maybe a class in Mythic Plus is going to have 3 buttons to use, yes, but maybe they also have 7 utility buttons, 3 stuns, 2 slows, an off heal, and multiple other things that make it more enjoyable. Whereas the ratings on the left chart are purely based on their rotation of damaging abilities. So that's what's gonna be next, and for now, with this I am done, and I will leave you in the comments flinging shit at each other because you wanted your favorite spec to be put S tier, and I will not be part of this. So see you guys soon.